The following episode may contain sensitive material, including descriptions of violence, sexual assault, or graphic descriptions of injuries to victims. If you feel you may be triggered by such material, please consider this before accessing our content. To access trauma counseling or services, please speak to a trauma specialist.
It felt like my eyes had literally been burnt out of my head. I thought they'd actually gone.
These bongos were located in an enclosure 2/3 up the way of a hill. They were not located on the top of a hill, which was a myth-busting fact for us.
Lightning is a very complex phenomenon. It's not always the same. It changes in its magnitude, its duration, and the actual direction and the type of charge that's moving.
My name is Joseph Luck. I was struck by lightning in '96 on the 14th of February whilst hiking in the Magaliesberg. So I was 14 years old at the time, first 3 weeks into standard 6 of high school. And as a family, we go hiking a lot, or did at the time, every weekend just about, in fact. And that weekend was no different to any other. I mean, you walk in the mountains here, it rains, sometimes you get thunderstorms, often lightning, but being from the high veld, that's standard.
On the South African high veld, we get convective thunderstorms. Air is sucked up into the cloud to create a cumulonimbus cloud. Complex physics in the cloud creates charges. There's the dipole theory, there's the tripole theory, but it basically becomes like a huge capacitor, 10 kilometers in diameter, up to 10 kilometers in height.
That day we were at Grootkloof in the Magaliesberg. We spent the day rock hopping down cliffs, swimming the pools. At about 2 o'clock, the thunderstorm head started building. At about 3, I think it started dripping, so we all packed up, climbed out the cliff, and started legging it back to the cars. Maybe about a kilometer or so in, we actually put our raincoats on because it was starting to rain pretty heavily. My cousin Amy and I decided that we were going to beat everyone else back to the cars. So we sort of really marched up ahead of everyone. And, you know, I turned back a couple of times, couldn't see anyone, so I knew we had a pretty decent lead on the pack. As we were going through, there's like a little dip in the walk. It's sort of between two ridges, just before the final descent down to the farm where we'd parked our cars. And just before that, I remember Amy actually turning and saying to me that she was having water running down her back because there was a little hole in her raincoat, just on the nape of her neck. I just said, well, you know, nothing to really be concerned about. Let's just trudge on. If you know the Magaliesberg, it sort of comes in two ranges. There's one set of hills and then a large valley, really big flat with farmland, and then there's another ridge. And you could see lightning striking, you know, sort of regularly on the far side. Nothing on our side, and as I was walking, it felt like someone had literally flicked the switch on my consciousness. So imagine 1 minute you are conscious, and the next someone just goes flick, and everything just like literally like a light going off. It doesn't mean that your consciousness is off, you're still thinking. You're still there, you're just not, if you understand what I mean. You're thinking, and by the time I'd actually come around, I'd actually figured out what had happened, which is the weirdest thing. I think I'd had some sort of lightning education at school, and somewhere in me being unconscious on the floor, I'd actually twigged what had happened. So it wasn't a surprise when I actually came around.
If one looks at ground flash densities over South Africa, most of the ground flash densities happen over the escarpment. We have about 26 flashes per square kilometer per year, which is relatively high compared to the rest of the planet. Due to the fact that the ground is dry in our region, we have a lot of cloud to ground and ground to cloud strikes, which makes our region a very lightning prone region.
Thankfully, I did actually come around because what had transpired is my cousin Amy, who was about 1.5 meters ahead of me, had received basically the full dose of lightning straight onto the back of her head. It actually burnt to her skull, and a theory I have is that it actually conducted the lightning away from her body and internals and actually ran down her back. And there was actually holes in her trousers where the lightning had jumped from her lower back and sort of butt to the ground again. In that way, she was spared being cooked alive, well, instantaneously. Myself, I was, I guess, shocked from underneath. There's no marks on me where it actually struck me or hit me, but I was definitely, taken out because my shoes actually melted onto the side of my foot. That's the one and only sort of scar that I actually received from this whole ordeal.
I think what we need to understand about lightning is it's a very strong function of storm activity. So where do storms happen? Storms happen where big clouds form. Where do clouds form? They form near and around mountains where the topology, or the land, forces air to move in a particular way.
Waking up from being unconscious was incredibly painful. All the muscles in my body had contracted because the jolt of electricity essentially said, right, pull in. So I was stuck in a ball on the floor, and to just roll up onto my knees and elbows, then up onto my knees, and to open my hands like that required the almost superhuman effort, just to do that. And at that point, I was acutely aware that I couldn't see anything. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but because I'd been sandblasted effectively from the lightning striking the ground, my corneas had sand embedded in them. So it was like literally my eyes were covered, not just covered, but embedded with mud. So I once I'd got regained control of my hands, I sort of did this to touch my eyes to see what was wrong with them. Obviously, because I couldn't feel much, I felt like my eyes had literally been burnt out of my head. I thought they'd actually gone. I couldn't feel anything. So it almost felt hollow. And that was horrific. You suddenly realize at age 14 that you are permanently disfigured and blind was probably one of the most scary moments of my life. Amy, who clearly got the worst of it, she was essentially dead. They had to resus her for 30 minutes. They'd pick her up, carry her, put her down, CPR. Thankfully, there was a lot of other climbers around, and there was a couple of people that actually really did know CPR. So they did a really good job on that. Thankfully, one of us actually regained consciousness. If both of us were in her position, one of us would have died. So her twin sister Claire helped me and tried to wash this mud out of my eyes, so at least I could see. But there was no point. It was literally embedded. I think it was at that point I suddenly realized that this inside of my shoe had melted onto my foot. So my shoes are literally burning onto me. So I sort of kicked them off. And there I am standing in shorts, t-shirt in the middle of the rain with lightning. And now the lightning was landing all over the place. It was like I can only guess it must be like being in a war. It wasn't like it had struck once and then it had moved on. No, it was landing there and there and there and there, everywhere. So every time, everyone was just like hitting the deck. And they knew we just knew we couldn't stay there. Eventually, we managed to make it all the way down the hill to the farmhouse where we'd parked our cars. Thankfully, my cousin had now started breathing on her own again. They called Rustenburg Hospital. They got an ambulance to come out. They obviously drove Amy out, and they met the ambulance on the way, got her to Rustenburg. They drove me through. They put us in a bed, and I was lying next to Amy, and I could hear her moaning. She was unconscious, but she was breathing, and her heart was working. But she was moaning. It's like a weird, I think it happens when you're unconscious. I spent only a couple of days in hospital. My cousin, unfortunately, she was in ICU for, I think it was about 3 or 4 days. They had to do emergency surgery to basically close up the hole on her head because there was a big patch that had been burnt. So they had to skin graft and all that sort of thing to get her right. And obviously I couldn't see anything. My eyes were all bandaged, and in fact, for weeks thereafter, it was like looking through frosted glass. The only lasting effect on me really is the fact that I suffer from dry eyes because the nerves that run across your cornea, I think, were pretty mashed up. Amy, she spent, it was probably in total, she spent about 4 weeks in hospital. The first sort of one was in ICU, which she was getting really patched up, and I mean, she had some pretty severe burns on her back, so all that was sort of being attended to. It was quite a long resusc, so it was about half an hour, but from drowning and electrocution, it seems that you can actually be resuscitated after that amount of time with almost, in fact, no sort of psychological damage or brain damage, and she turned out perfectly fine. I mean, I think initially she was a bit confused about dates and times. She was probably about 6 months to a year behind, so it seems like the short term, just that chunk of Mary, and even that, I think she actually recovered in the end. And now she's perfectly normal, healthy human being with a little son and family and living life, going climbing and hiking and everything we were doing before. So, man, someone was looking out for us that day. We both made full recovery. So yeah, it's our luck was with us that day.
When it comes to lightning safety on mountains, the highest point is more at risk. However, lightning does not read textbooks. We've seen people struck at the foot of hills, halfway up the hill, and at the top of the hill. However, as a general rule of thumb and as a guideline, try and get away from the highest point during a thunderstorm. Even though I am a human forensic pathologist, I've been involved in a surprising amount of animal-related forensic cases. Once I was involved in a case of whooping cranes from Florida, United States, which were killed by lightning. I've also been involved in several other animal-related lightning deaths. Wild dogs in Etosha, elephants from India, rhinoceroses, giraffes. Critically endangered species must have a lightning protection plan. On the 12th of January 2012, I was called to the scene of death of 2 bongos. Bongos, Trachylophus species, are incredibly rare antelope from Central Africa. Apparently, these were the last breeding pair in captivity. Each one was estimated at between 200 to 300,000 rand at the time. These antelope were found dead at the Pretoria Zoo.
I'm Professor Adrian Tordif. I currently work at the University of Pretoria, but in 2012 I was a clinical veterinarian here at the National Zoo. It was evening in January, early January, and there was quite a storm that night. The following morning, on the 12th of January, we got a call to say that the 2 bongos were lying under the tree and that they suspected they were dead. So we immediately came up here, had a look around. Quite early on already suspected that lightning was the cause of the problem. Everything was wet, their coats were wet. The one mother and calf were lying very close to each other under just that tree right over there behind me, and both were stone cold dead. We then loaded them up and took them down to the veterinary hospital so that we could conduct a post-mortem. Professor Emily Lane was the pathologist on duty, and in discussion with her we immediately thought there would be lightning strike as a cause. We didn't find any external burn wounds or anything like that on the skin, but I mean it's highly variable as to what you can get depending on the actual situation at the time. What was evident that both of these animals had been standing under the tree trying to get out of the actual rain. They were probably both completely covered in water, so completely wet. The lightning appears to have hit the tree itself, and that morning we could see the black line down the bark where the lightning had hit. Probably traveled down halfway down to the tree, just about a meter or so above the ground. It probably jumped from the tree to the female, killed her, and then but also passed on the current to the calf that was standing next to her, and both were probably killed very quickly. Professor Lane was familiar with some of Ryan's work and his PhD study that he'd done on lightning strike in humans, and so she consulted with him, and then we basically, together with some other lightning researchers from WITS, we wrote up a presentation on this whole case. They discussed the various factors that were involved and how potentially you could try and protect this area against lightning strike in future.
2 dead bongos at the base of an exotic tree. The one bongo's horn was submerged in soil for a depth of 5 centimeters, and there was a plume of froth at the nostrils. The other bongo showed no external injuries. Oftentimes in forensics, one finds a plume of froth at the nostrils of a dead person or animal. In human forensic pathology, one finds a plume of froth typically in drowning cases and in heroin deaths. The thinking as to why one gets a plume of froth at the nostrils is quite fascinating. The current thinking is that there is an agonal period. In other words, death is not instantaneous. There are 1 or 2 inspirations and expirations before death. And there is also leaking of protein-rich alveolar fluid into the airways. So with these terminal agonal respirations, breathing in and breathing out before death, it whips up the alveolar fluid into an egg meringue, which displays itself as a plume of froth at the nostrils.
The bongos are interesting on several levels, apart from the tragedy that was involved in terms of a rare animal. It's how do you protect or how do you understand lightning? And this we can get from watching video, and we can use our understanding of lightning physics. And I think it's interesting to look at what was the likely injury mechanism there. The fourth well understood injury mechanism is what we call step potential. This is something that we would typically see with something like a cow or a horse or an animal sheltering nearby a tree. And the injury happens by current flowing through the feet, up through the body, and then down through the other feet. If it's a human being, you obviously need, the reason it's called step potential is it's from one foot to another foot. And we would have a voltage difference, a potential difference between that.
Upon examination of the bongos at autopsy, we found petechiae on the heart muscle of the antelope species. Petechiae are non-specific findings typically found in asphyxial deaths. These are deaths due to lack of oxygen. Petechiae are small dot-like hemorrhages found in unsupported tissue structures that are exposed to negative pressure. Your post-capillary venules rupture, creating dot-like hemorrhages on the epicardial surface of the heart, which is on the surface of the heart. We also find it within the fissures of the lungs. Sometimes we find it in the eyes. It is typically found in soft tissues, unsupported tissues that are exposed to negative pressures. These bongos were located in an enclosure 2/3 up the way of a hill. They were not located on the top of a hill, which was a myth-busting fact for us. One thinks that the top of the hill will be struck. Furthermore, there were a lot of electricals surrounding the enclosure. There was a cable car, there were wires. Yet despite these electricals, these bongos were killed by lightning. There is a theory called the theory of equipotentialization. This theory states that if there's a lot of plumbing and electricals and wires, your area should be safe from lightning strike. This is not true. Nowhere is safe outdoors in a thunderstorm. When thunder roars, get indoors.
Lightning is a very complex phenomenon. It's not always the same. It changes in its magnitude, its duration, and the actual direction and the type of charge that's moving. By and large, lightning will strike the tallest point, but this is not always true, and lightning can indeed directly strike something that's lower than another point.
EPR, Earth Potential Rise. This is where lightning is injected into the ground. at 1,000,000 volts or 1,000,000,000 volts. And this lightning travels through the surface of the ground like ripples on the surface of the water. If there is a quadruped, an animal with 4 legs standing there, the front legs may be at a different potential difference than the back legs. And this causes the current to be driven from the front legs to the back legs, and in between is a heart. And this is why whole herds of animals will get wiped out by the 4th mechanism of lightning injury, otherwise known as EPR, Earth Potential Rise. If one ever comes across a dead herd of animals, the differential diagnosis would be number 1, lightning, number 2, hypothermia, or number 3, poisoning. And it is very important to differentiate those 3. After thorough scene investigation, meticulous autopsy, and lightning data from the South African Weather Service, we concluded that death was most likely in keeping with lightning strike.
So now I've got a very healthy respect for lightning. In fact, I look back and I actually sort of kicking ourselves, how could we have been so blasé about lightning? But it was just something we did.
Many people in southern Africa believe that certain trees ward off lightning, and they think that it would be safe to shelter under those trees during a lightning storm. The San in the Northern Cape, for example, the Komani San, believe that the shepherd's bush, or in Afrikaans the witgat tree, its scientific name is the Boscia albitranca, is never struck by lightning. So if there was a lightning storm, they would shelter underneath it. Other people, Swazis, believe different other trees like the sausage tree and the Cape plane tree are never struck by lightning, but it's not a safe place to be during a lightning storm. If the tree gets struck by lightning, you could be injured in a variety of ways.